10 days before he died, Samuel Collins told a 14-year-old boy exactly what to say if anyone ever found the body.
And the boy remembered. When investigators finally got it out of him, his first condition was that his parents not find out.
The police looked at a dead man with both jugular veins cut, rope around his limbs, clothes buried under a boulder 200 feet away, and announced suicide. This is the story of Samuel Collins and Clyde Felt.
Hannah and Jess, we got away. Now we're unpacking what they won't say. Behind temple walls and cover-ups. We're pouring tea in your coffee cups. It's the post-Mormon post-mortem. Digging up what they want forgotten. Trauma, truth, and crime, yeah, we're surviving. It's post-Mormon post-mortem.
Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortem, the podcast where we lovingly sift through the ashes of our former faith, one bizarre belief and repressed memory at a time.
We explore everything from the church's cultural weirdness and doctrinal whiplash to the deep wounds of religious trauma, Mormon crime, and the messy, glorious road to recovery.
Whether you're freshly out, years removed, or just ex-curious, this really is the right place. We're here to hold space, spill tea, and call out the cultish stuff hiding in plain sight. I'm your host, Hannah.
And I'm Jess.
Salt Lake City, Easter Sunday, 1902. 10 boys go camping on the hillside north of the city. The Salt Lake Herald says they made careful, preliminary arrangements and left Warm Springs early that morning with enough provisions for a full day's outing. One of those boys was Raymond Ward, in some reports called James Ward. The Herald reported, quote, something unusual arrested the attention of Raymond Ward, close quote. He had seen a group of large rocks lying flat about 25 feet from the head of the ravine, quote, as if they had been rolled there from the mountainside, close quote. Then at the same time, one of the other boys, Mason Williams, climbed higher up along this hillside and found a pair of men's shoes.
So the Herald says both boys, quote, immediately were of the opinion that a crime had been committed, end quote. So as you'll see, the children immediately understood the scene better than the police did.
In the cave, the boys saw the body of a nude man with a terrible gash across his throat. Naturally, they were horrified and ran back down into the valley with daring and dangerous speed, so said the newspapers, to alert the authority. First on the scene was Officer Gillespie and another police officer, and they are top-notch Keystone cops. They tore away the stones that had been used to wall up the cave's entrance and crawled inside.
Inside the cave, the paper says, Gillespie sees, quote, a long white form, feet first, quote, and then the lifeless features of a dead man. P.J. Johnson, a young man on the scene, crawls into the hole, grabs the man by the heels, and pulls the body out feet first until they can see the face. Officer Gillespie sent a boy to summon acting coroner Nielsen and other policemen. Then officers began searching the area, while leaving the body lying on a heap of rocks. So the crime scene preservation is going beautifully. The Deseret News ran the headline, Morbid Crowd Gathers, and reported, quote, word spread rapidly throughout the city, and the ravine soon became a gathering point for men, women, and children, many bringing their families to view the body, end quote.
It was just a fun day out. They said almost every foot of ground was gone over by people looking for evidence. But little or nothing was found. Yes, it was probably all trodden into the mud. It said boys and men, quote, by the score, walked over the hills and cave around the ravine. By the time that officials tried to reconstruct what had happened, obviously the hillside was trampled by searchers and spectators and families out for a Easter Sunday corpse viewing. So who was Samuel Collins, the dead man in the cave?
The Deseret News describes him as, quote, about 65 years old and of excellent habits, end quote. They reported that although he was in his 65th year, he appeared much younger. He was 6 feet in height, of slender build, wore no beard, and his features might have been taken for those of a clergyman. The same article reported he abstained from both liquor and tobacco and, quote, led a modest life. He was a Civil War veteran and told people that he was a member of a Masonic lodge. He'd come to Salt Lake City from San Francisco about 10 years earlier, and he'd worked at the Old Central Machine Shops, the Wasatka Bottling Works, and the Worm Springs. In the months before his death, he was taking care of the Wasatka Works, preparing his own meals, and living alone.
People who knew Samuel Collins vouched for him. A co-worker, Frank Barnes, told investigators that Collins was, quote, well-educated, well-mannered, and had seen a great deal of the world, close quote. Barnes said, I doubt very much if anyone would have been able to lure him up to the hills to murder him, as he was very suspicious and seemed to be fearful that someone would rob him. Then the paper quoted Mrs. Orson Parker of 413 West 2nd North Street, a place that Collins had boarded at until a month previously. She said that he was given to brooding and had spells of despondency because of losses in mining deals. Quote, he used to tell me of his hard luck, said Mrs. Parker. He always appeared to have plenty of money with which to pay his bills. But if he ever had any large amount of money, I never learned of it. And he used to tell me many of his affairs.
Mrs. Addie Felt recalled that, quote, the last she saw of Collins was last Monday morning when he came to the house to borrow a hatchet to chop some kindling. She asked him when he was going to New York, having previously heard from her boys that he was going east, and he replied that he did not know on what day he would go, end quote.
He had also apparently been giving away belongings, a watch, a Masonic charm, $5 in gold. Now, I'm going to insert a small piece of Masonic history here. Now's as good a time as any. At the inquest that was held the day after his body was found, it was asserted that Collins had said he was a Mason, but nobody could verify that because he didn't belong to any local lodges. And they actually brought in to the inquest a Mason named James Kiefer to testify. They were like, do you recognize this man? Can you say whether or not he was a Mason? He said he didn't know Collins, couldn't say whether he was a member of the lodge. So the county attorney tells the jury incidentally for the inquest is picked by acting county attorney Nielsen. The coroner, he just picks them, you and you from the crowd on the hillside that has gathered. It's like, come to the courthouse tomorrow morning for the inquest. And their names are printed in the paper. So he tells the attorney tells the jury that James Kiefer might still have important testimony on the question of whether or not Collins was a Mason after he had viewed his remains. So they take him to privately view the body, okay, and then ask the question whether or not he's a Mason. So whatever the county attorney was told doesn't make the record, but it's interesting that he was taken to privately view the remains in order to answer the question. So I had done some digging into Masonic history a little while ago and happened to have unearthed that answer inadvertently. Do you know why it would have been, Jess?
No.
So Masons used to identify each other through small tattoos that they would, like a dot, that would be placed somewhere that only a brother examining you would know. So I guess it would be like a way you could tell it on a body whether somebody had been a Mason. Like you might have a tiny dot tattoo between your fingers or between your toes or something, right? So upon inspection of a body, I think that was the most likely reason that Kiefer was called to look at the body, was to identify one of those marks.
Wow.
In my opinion.
That's really interesting.
So far, we have a sketch of a respectable old man, Civil War veteran, modest habits, no drinking, no smoking, worked steadily, lived hard, lived alone, worked hard, had hard luck, looked almost like a clergyman.
That version of Collins is going to sit very uneasily beside what the boys in the neighborhood started telling the police.
Clyde Felt was the boy who would end up eventually charged in Samuel Collins' death. He was 14 years old.
Though the papers can't keep that straight. Half the coverage calls him anything from 11 to 15. We're going with what his mother and the complaint say, and we're going to flag that the papers were sloppy about it the whole way through. The Ogden Standard Examiner reported that Collins was friends with many of the neighborhood boys. In fact, the paper says Clyde Felt and Samuel Collins were, quote, almost inseparable, and that the neighborhood boys had received, quote, many small tokens of friendship from their aged comrade, end quote. Then comes a sentence that might make you stop and pause. It did me. The paper says, quote, one of them usually passed the night with him, end quote.
The Deseret News described the same relationship. It said that Clyde Felt had managed to gain the old man's confidence and friendship to a greater degree than one usually accords, and that together with the boys, Samuel Collins shared many of his secrets and hopes.
One of the neighborhood boys told police that he'd known Collins for 2 years, and he reported that Collins sometimes acted as if he was demented, and that on the Sunday afternoon before Collins disappeared, Collins was suffering from melancholia. This neighborhood boy believed Collins might have killed himself. And this matters because the first official fight over this case is whether Samuel Collins was murdered at all.
We obviously need to establish what the body showed. Was Samuel Collins murdered, or did he kill himself?
Dr. Mayo, the county physician, examined the body and said the wound didn't look self-inflicted. He explained that when a man cuts his own throat, the incision is usually irregular. It usually angles upward depending on whether the person is right-handed or left-handed. Collins' wound was different. Mayo says the cut was, quote, evidently made by a quick, short stroke from a very sharp instrument, end quote, and it runs straight across the throat, severing the trachea and penetrating almost to the esophagus.
Mayo also described scratches on Collins' nose as if his face had been rubbed or dragged on a rough surface. The front of his body was smeared with dirt, which Mayo said indicated it had been pushed over the damp earth. He found bruises on Collins' limbs and said that those bruises showed that they occurred before death, that Collins had been dragged and handled roughly.
Mayo says both jugular veins had been cut. And since those veins carry blood from the brain, Collins would have lost consciousness almost immediately. Mayo does not believe Collins could have remained conscious for more than 15 seconds or lived longer than 5 minutes.
Okay, so therefore it would have been impossible, as was self-evident, that it was impossible for Collins to cut his own throat outside the cave, crawl into the hole, pile up the stones the way they were found at the mouth of the cave, including stones that were piled up clearly only from the outside, then position his body inside the cave with the amount of blood that there was. No, he says the wound was inflicted inside the cave. It is direct. The wound could never have been self-inflicted. He was unequivocal on that. Because Collins, how did he dispose of the knife or do anything afterward in his 15 seconds before losing consciousness?
Right. Associate County Physician Ellerbeck agrees. Ellerbeck is, quote, practically sure that Collins did not kill himself, end quote.
And Salt Lake City Police looked at all the evidence and said, okay, suicide.
They did. The Salt Lake Herald reports, quote, the police officers are practically unanimous in support of the theory of suicide, in spite of the fact that the county officials announced at the department headquarters that it was a case of foul murder. So the police gave their theory to the Tribune. They say there is no convincing motive for murder, while Collins has possible motives for suicide. Collins had lost money, had been involved in mining deals, and may have felt remorse. Officer Roberts tells the Tribune that Collins had, quote, deliberately sought the seclusion of the lonely cave, end quote, and removed his clothing and other evidence of identity. Roberts says Collins could have piled the stones at the cave entrance from the inside and then cut his throat.
As for the rope, Officer Roberts suggested it should just be dismissed. Quote, the rope has no significance whatsoever. The way they jumped to conclusions and then just pin all their hopes on one theory is so wild. The Herald put it plainly. It is passing strange that a man should divest himself of all clothing, tie a rope tightly around his body, wall himself into a cave, tear out his eye and cut his throat as neatly as a butcher cuts the throat of a sheep.
And beyond that, after he has cut his throat, he secretes the knife with which he has accomplished his own destruction, end quote.
Or put another way, a man can kill himself, but he cannot afterwards bury himself.
And then Colin's missing bloodstained clothes turned up, found buried under a boulder about 200 feet from the cave. The paper says this seems to dispose of the suicide theory. The area had already been searched, so police believe the clothes might have been placed there within the previous 24 hours. So if it wasn't a suicide, we're looking for a perpetrator. Who killed Samuel Collins? And before we get into Clyde's ever-changing account of what happened there, if you're finding this useful, we do this every week. We can help you support the show by directing you to our Patreon or our buy us a coffee at the links in the show notes. It keeps us going, and we're super grateful for it. Clyde Felt was the last known person reported to have seen Collins alive, and naturally reporters wanted what he had to say. The papers printed his story as follows. Quote, I was going past the Wasaka place on the way down to the springs to hunt up Henry Potts. Mr. Collins saw me going past and shouted to me, Come here, boy. He always called me by that name. I went over to where he was standing, and he said he would give me a quarter if I would carry his grip up the hill. All right, I said, where's the quarter? He handed it to me, and then we started up the hill. He didn't seem to be much different than usual. When we got up on the other side of the peak, he started down a path in the direction of the hollow, and I started to follow him. Then he turned around and told me I didn't need to follow him any farther. You better go home, he said, and shook hands with me and said goodbye. You won't ever see me again, he said. I'm going to take the early train to New York. Then I turned around and ran down the hill. That was the last time I saw of him alive.
Clyde said, quote, for several days past, Collins, has been telling me that he would leave in a few days for New York. Sunday, when I visited him at the Woodsucker Works, there was another boy there, a boy I don't know. And after repeating that he was going to leave the city, he held out his watch and a $5 gold piece, telling me to take my choice. Boys, I want you to take these things to remember me by, to show you I am a good man, he said. My relatives have sent me some money, and I'm going to live with them. I took the watch, Clyde says, and the other boy took the money.
So Collins gives the boys money and small gifts, watches, Masonic charms, quarters to carry his bag. He affectionately always calls Clyde boy. He is, to the neighborhood, a lonely old man who has found comfort in the company of local boys, none of who know what happened to him.
Okay, Clyde's story is that he saw Collins, and Collins told him that he was going to New York.
Mm-hmm.
And his next story, it doesn't say that he killed Collins. No, the headline is, Salt Lake Boy was with Collins when he suicided. The Ogden Standard Examiner said, had any reporter ventured to suggest as a possibility the facts contained in the narrative told by this lad, his sanity would have been immediately questioned. And a story that so hung together, such a plot would have been regarded as too imaginative for his profession. Close quote.
The story is this. Officer Roberts and Gillespie believed Clyde knows more than he has said. They questioned him, quote, persistently and patiently, end quote, for 5 days with the classic good cop, bad cop routine, which they spelled out to newspaper reporters.
Officer Roberts was supposed to coax Clyde, and Officer Gillespie was supposed to frighten him. The article says, quote, in a few sentences, Roberts would coax, and then Gillespie would growl and threaten. So Clyde finally says, well, I'll tell you. It was a suicide.
He asked for a promise that the story would be kept from the newspaper so his parents wouldn't hear the details. The paper says the promise was given, quote, doubtless with a mental reservation, end quote.
With your fingers tied behind your brain.
Mhm.
Okay, so Clyde's original story has now changed. Collins didn't just simply send him home with a handshake and say goodbye to him. Clyde says Collins told him back and told him to wait at the point of the hill while he hid a grip that contained secrets. So Collins came down later, told him he was going to kill himself, and he wanted Clyde to cover this cave with stones and hide the clothes. Clyde said, quote, the old man had been good to me, and I did not like to refuse to do a little thing for him, so I told him I would do it.
He says Collins gave him 60 cents, took the hatchet and towel, and went into the ravine. Clyde waited, came back, found blood at the cave entrance, hid the clothes under the rocks, wiped the razor blade with his fingers, threw the razor onto a ledge, and piled rocks in front of the cave. He says he had seen Collins lying dead inside before he finished covering the entrance. He also says he washed blood from his hands in the cold water running from the Warm Springs bathhouse. When another boy asked where the blood came from, Clyde said, "Oh, I killed a hawk."
Yeah, he told several of the boys in the neighborhood that day who saw blood on his hands that he had killed a hawk. So I imagine it was quite a bloody scene. So officers asked Clyde whether he could find the razor that he had used. When they were bound and determined that this was a suicide, they searched every inch of the cave for the knife because they were like, it has to be in here. It has to be in the cave because it was a suicide. So it must be here. They got prisoners from the jail to come and search the cave. That's how determined they were to find this, to make their suicide theories. Clyde said he guessed he could find the razor, and they took him back to the ravine, the scene of the crime. Clyde pointed out the ledge where the first stone that was moved revealed a black-handled, wide-bladed razor.
So the officers rushed back down the hill to report their announcement. Quote, "It was a suicide, and we have the evidence."
Yeah, the evidence is not going to hold.
Clyde didn't hold to his I act alone story for long. The Tribune ran the headline, "Conflicting Stories Told by Clyde Felt." It reported that Clyde made another confession at 11 o'clock at night at the county jail. This version added his buddy, Henry Potts. Henry Potts was Clyde's close friend, and Clyde now says Henry was with him at the cave, and it was Henry who actually cut Collins' throat.
So instead of it being a suicide, it's now a murder, but he wasn't the one who did it. It was Henry.
Right.
And the cops just couldn't understand why Clyde was being so reticent to not confess. Sheriff Naylor asked Clyde, quote, "You are bound by an oath not to tell on each other, aren't you?"
And then Clyde admitted, well, yeah, there was an oath, but refused to explain it. He insists Henry was there. In this version, Collins took off his clothes, laid down, and Henry got the razor and cut his throat.
Really, it's like so interesting that the police are just, they offer him these stories, right? Like these explanations.
Feed him the,
And you know it's like revealing of their mindset, right? The mindset is, I was thinking, just because they've all taken these secret oaths and covenants, they were probably all Masons and Mormons, right? So to them, their mindset is, of course, with your brotherhood, you have
Right.
these secret oaths that you will never reveal these things on pain of death because they did it in the temple every week.
Mhm.
So Clyde is like, yeah, that's it. Yeah, an oath.
Of course,
That's
that's
it,
what we
an oath.
did.
That'll do,
Ah, it's
right? I
insane.
can't-
Just feed him his alibi.
Right, exactly. And then Henry Potts, as you can imagine, immediately denied his involvement. And he said, "Let me see him and I will dare him to say it to my face." And the jailers were like, you know what, probably make that happen. And the paper said that Clyde and Henry were brought face to face in the jail. If you
Wow.
can believe that. Their dads were there too. And Clyde's uncle, David Felt's brother. And Clyde says to Henry in front of all these witnesses, "You know you were up there with me."
And Henry answers, "You know I was not there." Henry's father cried and insisted his son was innocent. The paper quotes him saying, "There is a God above us, and he knows I am innocent." Henry doesn't stay accused for long. The Tribune later reports that Clyde admitted he implicated Henry because he was lonely in jail and wanted company. Clyde says, quote, "The only reason I know of for telling the story about Henry is because I was lonesome and I wanted someone to be in here with me. We have always been chums, and I thought the officers would let him keep me this awful place if he was locked in here."
I bet they're not going to be chums for much longer.
Mm-mm.
Right? So Clyde, it didn't take him long, as you said. Within the day, he had said he'd reneged his accusation against Henry, and then he asks Henry to forgive him. "Old Henry, old pal, please forgive me for trying to pin a murder on you." And when Henry came into the cell, Clyde said, what I said about you, Henry, was not true. And I want you to forgive me for telling such a thing." And I love Henry's response. "I know it wasn't true." He's like, "Yeah, I knew it wasn't true when you told it last night. You didn't have to tell me it wasn't true." Yes, it wasn't true. I could just see him being like, he's like, "What I said about you, Henry, it wasn't true." Yeah, I know.
Duh.
Exactly.
Henry had an alibi. In fact, he was able to give a minute-by-minute account of the afternoon Collins died. At least 8 witnesses were ready to verify his account. Henry had come home from school, missed Clyde, found him near Anderson's store, and rode home in a delivery wagon. Other boys were with him. He went looking for Clyde, asked Clyde's sister Rose where he was, asked Clyde's brother Ernest.
Henry became confused enough to doubt his dates. He was telling the officers that his alibi was Tuesday and the killing was Monday. And the papers note that for an hour of sweating, a boy with 8 witnesses nearly talked himself into a cell.
The next headline was Clyde Felt confesses he killed Collins. Clyde now admits he cut Collins' throat, stripped the body, bound it, walled up the entrance, and buried the blood-stained clothes. He still says Collins asked him to do it. In fact, Clyde claimed Collins had begged him for hours to commit the act because Collins wanted to die and was afraid to kill himself. Clyde says, quote, "He had frequently asked me to do it for him. I was afraid to, but I finally did. Then when he was dead, I took off his clothes, threw the razor up on the bank, and walled in the cave." End quote.
Okay, Clyde's dad, David Felt, and his uncle sat beside him at the police headquarters, and they begged him to say whether there was anyone else involved, and they thought there was. They definitely thought there was. Apparently, Clive just smiled and appeared indifferent while his uncle and his father pled for the truth with tears running down their face.
So sad. David Felt says, quote, "Clyde, don't you know that your parents would rather have seen you dead than in this position?" End quote. And Clyde just smiled and asked, "Let me see the papers. I want to see what they say about me." His father and uncle kept asking about accomplices, and Clyde kept saying, "I have told you all I know. No one else was with me. I did it alone."
Asked whether Collins had asked Clyde to kill him before, Clyde says, "Oh yes, many times." Collins had been begging him for more than a month. Other neighborhood boys had said exactly the same thing. They corroborated it independently. Asked what happened in the cave, Clyde says Collins took off his clothes and told him, "I want you to kill me this time. I've told people that I was going away to New York, and it won't do now for me to come back. You had better kill me now." Clyde says, "I didn't like to do it, but he begged me so hard that I just couldn't refuse."
Well, he asked so nicely. He says Collins lays down, put the rope around himself, and Clyde wrapped his hands. Then Clyde took the razor and cut his throat. Clyde said, quote, "The blood flowed all over my hands, and I wiped it off on the towel."
When he was asked what Collins' last words were, Clyde said he didn't say anything more after he said, "I'd better kill him." Asked whether Collins watched him while he cut his throat, Clyde said his eyes were open. "I don't know whether he watched me or not." Asked whether he was afraid, Clyde said, "Gee, yes. I was scared, but he begged me, so I did." Clyde admitted that he also didn't finish building the wall outside the cave of stones on the first day. He built it partway up, and then he got frightened and he had to go back and finish it the next day.
After Clyde confessed, the newspapers changed their description of Samuel Collins from sober, modest, and clergyman-like, now asserted that he had sexually abused or corrupted boys in the neighborhood. The language is 1902 language, terms like moral degeneracy, sexual pervert, and moral perversion.
I mean, he was having the boys spend the night with him every night. County physician Mayo declared, "This is plainly a case of moral perversion," closed quote. He said the confession from Clyde confirmed what he believed since he first examined the body. Well, that Collins didn't take his own life. Obviously that. But Mayo says the old man was a degenerate, but there are circumstances connected with the case which the general public did not suspect, closed quote.
So how does the community go about explaining this? The newspaper ran a story under the headline, "Psychological Phase, Collins a Pervert with Influence Over Boys." The article said it has been fully confirmed that Collins had a demoralizing influence over the boys in the neighborhood.
County Attorney Christensen questioned Clyde, quote, from a scientific standpoint, according to the paper. So basically probably doing a forensic interview. Clyde was reluctant to discuss what had happened, but the article says he disclosed, quote, the character of Collins' depravity, close quote. After talking to Clyde, County Physician Mayo confirmed that Collins had been abusing the boys in the neighborhood, multiple boys, over at least 2 years.
Emil Nett admitted to newspapers that while visiting Collins, he had been paid to participate in what the papers called Collins' unnatural practices. Raymond Johnson told officers that Clyde and Henry had told him several times how they had strapped Collins down to a board. Collins would bet them a nickel they couldn't tie him down. After strapping him down, the boys gave him chloroform from a bottle to put him to sleep.
So it transpires that Collins had been asking the boys separately over months to perform what he called a surgical operation. He told them he could take chloroform so it wouldn't hurt and offered them $25. He said he needed a razor and a butcher knife. Collins was asking these boys to castrate him, just in case you weren't picking up what I was putting
on
down.
What that was, right? Dr. Mayo confirmed it was consistent with what he had observed, that it was not uncommon in his experience for men in Collins' condition to want such an operation performed on themselves. The hatchet, the stakes, the rope, the towel, the butcher knife found near the cave. The Tribune argued these were the instruments Collins had assembled for that purpose.
Collins had asked Clyde directly about 10 days before the cave. He asked whether Clyde and Henry were close companions. He asked if Clyde would like to dress his body. When Clyde didn't understand, Collins explained he wanted Clyde to cut his throat, and after he was dead, cut his body into pieces and hide them in the coal stove so no one would ever find out. Clyde said he had a peculiar feeling, I hope so, and didn't answer. And then Collins allegedly brought it up several more times. Collins had constructed the secrecy deliberately. He coached Clyde in advance on exactly what story to tell if the body was found. He'd said Clyde was to say that he had gone to New York. He told him to make sure that nothing was left around that would identify who he was, and to not let anyone find out that he hadn't gone to New York. And I have to say, Clyde did a really shit job at all of that.
Oh my gosh.
He didn't.
He did.
He did not follow those instructions well.
He didn't. And for a lot of reasons, right? The trauma of all of it.
I know. Like,
not the least.
If you want to perform a murder well, do you really ask a 14-year-old neighborhood kid?
No. And to that, Clyde told investigators, quote, "I hated the sight of him. I hated to meet him because I hated him so. He could make me do things I didn't want to do, but when he told me to do something, it seems like I always done it. It was that way ever since I ever saw him. It seemed like I just couldn't help myself," end quote. So the boys kept the secret. The police read the silence as a secret society, and the papers ran with it. After Henry was cleared, officers took Clyde back to Hell's Hollow. Clyde was taken to the cave with Sheriff Naylor, Chief Hilton, Joseph Felt, Officers Roberts, Chase, and Gillespie, and Deputy Sheriff Busby.
The Herald reported that Clyde Felt acted his part in the crimes. The paper says that Clyde walked up the steep path beside Officer Gillespie. As he neared the cave, he showed no visible emotion. He pointed out where he'd hidden the clothes and all the other stuff that he had just laid scattered haphazardly around, apparently in his effort to not allow any identifying items to be found. When an officer questions some of his statements, Clyde says, "I've told you I would tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and I am telling it," close quote. And it's hard to imagine Clyde has much shred of credibility left, but he can hope.
The police then tested whether his description of moving Colin's body was physically possible. They had been operating under the assumption that it would have been impossible for one person to do this alone. Officer Chase, who weighed about 50 pounds more than Collins, lay in the position Clyde described. Clyde crawled into the cave and demonstrated how he says he cut Collins' throat. Clyde said, quote, "Well, he just kept begging me until I couldn't refuse to. I just stooped this way and then took the razor in my right hand and just pressed hard on it and jerked it across his throat. The blood just bubbled out, but it did not spurt." End quote.
That'd be hard to ever get over. Clyde said he'd taken off his coat first so he wouldn't get blood on his clothing, and then he showed how he pushed the body around with his hands, and he sat on a rock and pushed it with his feet. And the Herald reported that in doing so, he was able to move Officer Chase into the same position as Collins's body had been, thus disproving the police theory that somebody else had to be involved because they were just so determined that. And the newspapers reported that while Clyde was demonstrating this movement, the officers reacted with surprise, and Clyde laughed. The Herald wrote that the laugh, quote, "re-echoed with a strange harshness through the narrow gorge," close quote.
The reenactment convinced the officers that Clyde could have moved Collins alone, and the reenactment also added a new detail: chloroform.
That's right, because we know about the chloroform, but at this point, the police didn't, and an empty chloroform bottle was found in the cave. The cave that the prisoners had gone over with a fine-tooth comb. And Clyde now says that Collins brought chloroform with him. Officer Roberts held up the small 2-ounce bottle and asked Clyde about it. And Clyde said, "Gee, how do you know that? I didn't think you knew anything, you fellows. You're all there. Hey, gee, you guys are all there. You're all right. You're smart." No, apparently he didn't have much confidence in the cops.
Clyde said that Collins put the chloroform in a handkerchief. Then he put the handkerchief over his face and told me not to kill him until he was asleep. Clyde called to him several times, got no answer, then cut his throat. Clyde says, quote, "I thought he was asleep, but when I cut it, he started and jumped and floundered around like everything. There was blood all over him." End quote.
The Herald wrote that the chloroform showed Collins feared pain too much to take his own life, yet he would drag a boy into a crime to do it for him. Thank you for listening. If you want to show us some love, hit follow or subscribe. The Felts were a prominent Mormon family, and I mean prominent in the name-dropping way that Mormons care about. It kind of makes me think of the Romneys these days.
The family patriarch was David P. Felt, president of the Utah Press Association. When his son became the center of a murder case, this wasn't some anonymous family on the edge of town.
No, David P. Felt came from a deeply Mormon immigrant family. His mother, Mary Louise Pyle, was from Somerset, England. Shout out all my English converts. She converted as a teenager, was thrown out of her home. She worked as a servant to earn her passage to the US. She crossed the Atlantic on the Golconda and came to Utah as one of thousands of British working-class converts who had been sold a vision of Zion. And this just feels really personal to me.
I bet it does.
So Clyde Felt's grandmother arrives in Utah as a teenage convert. Within 5 days of her being in Salt Lake City, Brigham Young is marrying her in Temple Square to Nathaniel Felt. Okay, and that marriage, she was the third wife, and that marriage did not last super long. By the time David Felt was 10, his parents were divorced, and his mother remarried. His stepfather was also a polygamist, and she was the third wife in that marriage too. So She lived long enough to become known by the title Dr. Pyle. She practiced homeopathy, which in that period, it gave women a way to practice medicine outside formal licensing. So she was designated as a doctor, and it was like uncertified or the understanding was that she had the skills to practice it. It was able to a way to practice medicine outside of formal licensing. She was respected enough that Charles W. Penrose, a senior apostle, spoke at her funeral, and at Addie Felt's funeral, Harold B. Lee spoke.
So for now, the important thing is that Clyde Felt comes from a family with standing, right? Mormon immigrant sacrifice, pioneer respectability, church connections, newspaper connections, and enough social capital that when Clyde is arrested, the press treats his family's grief as part of the public story.
Clyde's mother, Addie Felt, spoke to the newspapers in grief and confusion and blame. Her comments ran in the Herald under the headline, "Felt's mother declares other boys are guilty." Addie Felt said, "I don't know what to say. I don't know what to think about it. I can't understand it. Clyde is only 14, just past his birthday. He's always been a good boy. Not quite so affectionate and demonstrative as his younger brother, but always good and obedient. And now to think of his being a party to this, it's too horrible, too horrible. I can't realize it." Close quote. Okay, so Clyde was the third oldest. The oldest of the Felt children was Francis, who actually went by Vernon. And then he had his older sister Vera, then it was him. Then his younger brother Ernest. George died in infancy. Then there was Renee and Norma. So that's where he fell in the family system.
So Mrs. Felt had a lot of kids to worry about. In the paper, they continue quoting her, and she says, "I never had the faintest suspicion that there was anything bad about that old man. I knew he was an old gossip, but thought he was nothing worse. If I or his father had ever dreamed the truth of this monstrous story that the doctors and the boys are telling, we would never have let Clyde go near him. But I trusted the old man. I thought it was better to have Clyde with him than in company with the Potts and Johnson boy and others of the Hot Springs gang." She remembered that Clyde had begged to go to Manti, where his father's brother, his Uncle Evan, lived. She said, "Oh, I wish we had let him go. It would have kept us out of all of this." She said she couldn't bear to read what the papers were saying, quote, "It kills me to see his picture there," end quote. And she said, "It seems that all our labors to bring our boy upright have amounted to nothing."
Clyde Felt's father, David Felt, framed the relationship with Collins as one of control. He said that Clyde had to have been hypnotized. He said, quote, "The boy was undoubtedly under hypnotic influence of Collins, as complete as any slave. When the old man would come to the house and say he wanted Clyde, we could not do a thing with the boy. He would drop everything and follow his master. When Collins said, 'Cut my throat,' I really believe that Clyde felt compelled to do it, like a person would be in a trance, and he did it." He said, "I think the others were implicated in the crime, but I don't care to say who I suspect." And then he turns to dime novels, of all things. Quote, "The motive for the crime may be found in the class of Dick Deadeye novels that my boy read. Without doubt, it was from such books that Clyde got his impulse to keep mum about the death of Collins." Close quote. So Clyde Felt's grandmother arrives in Utah as a teenage convert. Within 5 days of her being in Salt Lake City, Brigham Young is marrying her in Temple Square to Nathaniel Felt. Okay, and that marriage, she was the third wife, and that marriage did not last super long. By the time David Felt was 10, his parents were divorced, and his mother remarried. His stepfather was also a polygamist, and she was the third wife in that marriage too. So she lived long enough to become known by the title Dr. Pyle. She practiced homeopathy, which in that period, it gave women a way to practice medicine outside formal licensing. So she was designated as a doctor, and it was like uncertified or the understanding was that she had the skills to practice it. It was able to a way to practice medicine outside of formal licensing. She was respected enough that Charles W. Penrose, a senior apostle, spoke at her funeral, and At Addie Felt's funeral, Harold B. Lee spoke.
So for now, the important thing is that Clyde Felt comes from a family with standing, right? Mormon immigrant sacrifice, pioneer respectability, church connections, newspaper connections, and enough social capital that when Clyde is arrested, the press treats his family's grief as part of the public story.
After Clyde's confession, David Felt had searched his own house and found 11 dime novels hidden under the building, along with the revolver that Clyde had bought with $5 taken from Collins' pocket.
The titles included Monte Cristo at 18, The Bradys and the Crossroads Gangs, The Bradys and the House of Mystery, Dick Merriwell's Revenge, and Fantoy, the Opium Queen.
God, I love Fantoy, the Opium Queen.
This sounds like a great one.
Actually, they do. The paper does give a plot synopsis. Okay, so the papers fold these dime novels into this wider story about the boys in the neighborhood and vice. And they trace it to what they call the twin evils of cigarettes and dime novels. So Clyde's friends were interviewed about him, and one of them said he didn't read the books, the dime novels. He didn't read many. But when he got hold of one, he would hardly lay it down until he had finished it. Close quote. That is a boy after my own heart. The reporter asked whether Clyde smoked, and one of his friends said, no, not regularly, but he has smoked cigarettes once in a while. Whether he drank? Yes. He sometimes drank beer. His father had some in the cellar. Whether he sneaked out a bottle occasionally? Yes. He has done that. Whether he gave the other boys a drink? Yes.
Wow, they're painting quite the picture here.
So at this point, a murder charge still had yet to be filed.
The Deseret News reported that it wasn't easy to find an officer willing to sign the complaint against Clyde. More than one officer refused to attach his name to the document that would force Clyde to appear in court on the charge.
The Ogden Standard-Examiner was pretty blunt about why. They said, quote, the revelations as to the character of Collins have filled the community with horror, and the officers who under ordinary circumstances would be perfectly willing to take oath that a crime had been committed hesitate to swear that the killing of Collins was a great crime, such as murder.
Chief Hilton eventually signed the complaint charging Clyde Felt with killing Samuel Collins on March 24, 1902, by striking him with a razor and inflicting a mortal wound. The courtroom was packed when Clyde appeared. The Deseret News says there was a great craning of necks when he took his seat. Clyde wore a neat suit, white shirt, collar, and tie. He watched closely as the complaint was read. Lawyers and officials disagreed publicly about the charge. Mr. Whitmore said the elements of murder, deliberation, and premeditation were all missing. He said, quote, the boy was induced to perform the act by one who had a very strong influence over him, end quote. District Attorney Eichner explained that after age 14, the law presumes a child has the capacity to commit a crime unless evidence shows otherwise.
Judge O.W. Powers said the case appears to be, quote, a willful, deliberate, premeditated killing done under circumstances in which the law would imply malice, close quote. Judge Dixon said that in the eyes of the law, a 14-year-old charged with murder is treated the same as a grown person. Still, because of Clyde's age, he personally didn't believe Clyde should be convicted of murder.
Wowza. So Clyde entered a plea of not guilty. The Tribune described him at the arraignment as wearing knee pants and a golf cap, looking, quote, entirely at his ease, as he leaned carelessly against a table and listened to the information being read. When asked for his plea, Clyde answered, not guilty.
Bail became its own issue. Judge King said the county jail wasn't the proper place for a child. Judge King was his lawyer, by the way. Don't be confused by the title judge. It wasn't a proper place for a child, and bail was fixed at $4,000. David Felt had a different concern. He didn't want Clyde released too quickly. He said, quote, visitors at the county jail have been patting Clyde on the back, lauding and excusing him for his deed. That is the last thing I want to have them do, and I have asked the jailer to warn callers against doing it. He said he wanted Clyde, quote, to realize the enormity of his crime and to suffer some punishment for it, close quote. That was why the family hadn't immediately gotten him out on bail, even though many people were willing to sign his bond. David Felt said, I really fear his friends more than his enemies.
So people were not only horrified by Colin, some were praising the child who killed him. In the jail, the little prisoner occupies the woman's ward. He recovered from the depression that followed his arrest and went back to his studies. He wrote a letter to his teacher in pencil because he had no ink in his cell, telling her that he was sorry he couldn't keep up with his work.
Now, the case became a sermon topic around Utah. The Deseret News ran a piece with lessons of the tragedy. It says the case, quote, revealed conditions and evils never suspected by the majority of our community to exist here, close quote. Conditions, quote, in some respects too vile to particularize. The lesson the paper drew was the need for parental vigilance. It urged parents to watch their children, to learn their habits and companions, to know what they read, to train them in the ways of the Lord. It names the work and mission of the Latter-day Saints as a protection needed against this kind of evil.
The same editorial absolves the parents. It says, quote, from what we have learned, the deep grief in which they are plunged flows from no shortcoming in the instruction on their part, end quote. The Springville Independent said that the friends of Mr. and Mrs. D.P. Felt remembered Clyde as an intelligent boy and believed, quote, he must have been under a most potent spell to have caused the commission of such a deed, end quote. And then Joseph F. Smith, president of the church, wrote about the case in the Juvenile Instructor, the church's publication for young people. He wrote, quote, we have learned of a recent terrible occurrence in this city wherein a little boy was influenced to commit murder by a wicked man, and the testimony of his friends was that it was brought about through reading dime novels and falling into diabolical habits taught by the wicked and ungodly among the Latter-day Saints. End quote. So the moral of the story for young people is avoid dime novels.
Joseph F. Smith had a documented case in his own city of an adult man who had cultivated relationships with boys over 2 years at least, paid them, given them gifts, and asked them to participate in sexual acts with him. He has a publication read by children across the church, and he writes in it to warn them about reading dime novels.
The legal case didn't go to trial. District Attorney Eckner had been considering dismissal for several reasons. He wanted to avoid making the details of the case public, and he was convinced Clyde would probably be acquitted. The Tribune wrote that many people in Salt Lake will be relieved if the case never comes to trial. It says that while there is little doubt Clyde caused Colin's death, it is, quote, believed by many that Collins deserved his fate.
In December 1902, the case was dismissed. District Attorney Eichner said he had carefully investigated the evidence and concluded that no jury would ever return a guilty verdict against the boy. The Tribune wrote that no jury could likely be picked in Salt Lake County that would find Clyde guilty of the crime charged, especially because the deed had no witness except Clyde and Collins and Clyde's confession. And Clyde could hardly be convicted on his own testimony against himself. That's never happened.
But Samuel Collins was dead. Clyde Felt admitted cutting his throat. Henry Potts was falsely accused and released. The murder charge was dismissed before trial, and the court record closes without a jury ever deciding what the killing legally meant.
Now, Clyde Felt did go to a reform school after this for at least a couple of years. Clyde went on a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He married in the Salt Lake Temple in June 1910 to Miss Lavon Nelson, although her name is actually Nielsen. The family later legally changed it from Nielsen to Nelson because it was probably getting misspelled all the time. The Salt Lake Tribune Society pages described the couple as popular young people, well and favorably known, with a host of friends sending their best wishes.
The same pages called Clyde a reformed newspaperman. He had worked as a reporter for the Denver Times and held a position with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. 8 years after he confessed to cutting an old man's throat in a cave, returned missionary Clyde Felt is a society page wedding announcement.
He and LaVon moved to Los Angeles and raised 3 daughters. They also had a son who died in infancy. And Clyde himself died in 1973 at the age of 85. Samuel Collins is buried in the county plat of the city cemetery, a plain pine coffin at the county expense.
There is one more Hell's Hollow detail. The Salt Lake Telegram reported that another body had been found in the same hollow 48 years before Samuel Collins died. Solomon Kimball, the city jailer, who had lived in Salt Lake all his life, told the paper that when he was a boy, he and several other boys found the body of a dead man in the same hole in Hell's Hollow where Collins' remains were later discovered. That body had also been partially covered with stones. Kimball could still name the boys who were with him: Ashton Nebaker, Bradford Elliott, Morrill Reese, and Charles Kimball. Boys found a body in that cave covered with stones twice, almost half a century apart. Only in Salt Lake City?
Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to this morbid and macabre episode. If it intrigued you, please share it. Leave us a comment, and if you want to keep the conversation going, you can find us on Instagram and TikTok and on the web.
Consider supporting us on Patreon. We've got memberships starting as low as $2 a month for ad-free listening. Your financial support helps keep us doing all the research, stepping through the analyses, and building this community. The links are in the show notes.
Big shout out to Hannah W. for the amazing theme song, Dr. Dave for the extra guitar, Peter for his editing chops, and Mick for making our theme song sound polished.
Hey, Hannah, I really gotta say, I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.
I am sorry for what I said when I was Mormon too.